including the current panelists here who are going to start things off for us today. I'm not going to belabor things with extended bios and introductions. You have the panelist bios before you. I will just identify them so you know who's talking. To my immediate left is Francis Townsend, followed by Robert Malley, Elliot Abrams, and Ali Shihabi. Their bios, you can read all about the incredible things they've done. I will give them a general introduction by saying that these are all people in a room full of people here who know a lot about this region and this topic. They know even more than us. And I'm hoping that you're all going to hear things that you agree with, hear things that you disagree with, and know that it's coming from a place of real expertise and authority, people who have been in the mix in a very serious way. So without further ado, let's just jump right in. The way I'd like to start this, actually, is to just say that, you know, this issue, Saudi-Iran confrontation, is kind of a perennial one. It's a bit of a chestnut, editors might say. And there's a lot of different ways you can look at it. There's a political angle of two regional hegemons, you know, in competition for power. There's an economic angle of hydrocarbon producers angling for market share. There's a civilizational or religious angle of a kind of sectarian conflict between a Sunni state and a Shia state. A feminist perspective might be that these are two deeply patriarchal societies engaged in an elaborate display of toxic masculinity, although, of course, that applies to a lot of countries right now, I think. So however you cut it up, it depends. The way you look at it can often dictate what you sort of think about it, the frame. And I think we're going to hear a lot of different frames, and I encourage you to think about how the folks here are framing the problem. Here's how I want to start. I want to take a little poll of our four experts here, a quick poll, and here's what I want to know. And I want you all to imagine Iran and Saudi relations on a scale, on a spectrum, from 1 to 10, with 1 being really bad, open conflict, violent conflict, war, some sort of overt confrontation, military confrontation between these two countries. And with 10 being really good, what Fran described earlier is the unicorn scenario, where there's a cooperation and peace and stability and everything is just great. So between 1 and 10. And what I'd like our panelists to answer is I want you to each give us 3 numbers. The first is, on that scale of 1 to 10, where were things in this relationship 5 years ago? That is right around the end of Obama's first term, before the beginning of the second term. Where were they 1 year ago, maybe right after Trump's election? Sorry, today, where they are today. And I'm not going to ask you to prognosticate 5 years out, but 1 year from now, where do you think things will be on that scale? That'll kind of tell a little story of the way you see the trajectory of this problem. Fran, let's start with you. 5 years ago, today, 1 year from now.
So let me preface it by saying I think you have to understand that that relationship is very much affected by the status of the U.S.-Saudi relationship.
Sure.
So I would say, you know, look, in a steady state, such as it is, between the two countries, if there's no open sort of disagreements, there is a, let's call it a benign skepticism, which I'll call somewhere between a 4 and a 5.
Okay.
I would say at the end of the Obama administration, you were 5 years ago, it was something even less than that, right? There was deep skepticism on the Saudi side about the Iran deal. They felt betrayed. We can debate whether or not that's a fair assessment. But, and I would say that the Iranian-Saudi relationship 5 years ago, we had begun to see a deterioration. So let's call it a 3.
Okay.
From the sort of steady state. Today, I think it has actually dropped, right? I think we know that there are proxy conflicts in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Bahrain. So I think that while the Saudis feel better about the U.S. relationship, I think there is the current relationship between the Saudis and the Iranians, let's call it a 2.
Okay.
I don't think you're going to see a lot change in the next year. I don't think a year is enough to resolve the proxy conflicts in all the states I just mentioned. Look, if you could get it back to a 3, you'd feel like you'd made some progress. But I do think that given these proxy conflicts, we are at a greater risk of strategic misunderstanding between the two states that could boil over into an open conflict.
Okay, Rob, so she said basically from a 5 to a 3 and then a 2 and then we don't know 1 year. What do you think?
So I'll be really quick, and I think we agree. It was 4, it is 3, it will be 2, unless they follow crisis group's recommendations, in which case we could be in unicorn zone and be at a 10.
All right.
Hard to quantify. I'd say 5.137. I basically agree. I'd say 5 years ago I'd put it at 4 to 5. Today I'd put it at about 2 to 3, and I would think it will stay there a year from now.
Okay. And Ali?
I would have put it exactly like everybody else at 4 a few years ago, at 3 now, and trending towards 2.
Okay, good. So I was hoping you would all agree on the general trajectory, because I think what's going to be interesting is to see how much you disagree about the reasons why that is, and I think that we'll leave it to our audience to see who they kind of judge. Let me start with you, Ellie. I'm hoping that you have a very good sense of Saudi sort of elite opinion and policy making, the opinion in the Saudi policy apparatus. Can you explain, as simply as possible, what the Saudi view of the origin of this conflict is? Not necessarily deep historical origin, but the origin of the current crisis, of say the past few decades at least, and why it is, from the Saudi point of view, that there's so much fear and distrust of Iran.
The fundamental misconception that you have among Western analysts and the media is that this is a rivalry, a competition for power, that these are sort of two big powers in the region and they're competing for influence. So there's a sort of natural space for that to happen. I think that's a misreading of it. The fundamental difference that doesn't always get understood is that Saudi Arabia is a status quo power. It's not interested in geographical expansion. It's very happy with what God has given it, if you want. It has oil, it's prosperous. It really wants security and safety. While Iran is a revolutionary power. Iran came out of a revolution that overthrew the Shah, and that came from day one and said, we are out to change the region. We want to overthrow the monarchies and sort of the governments that Iran thought deserved to be overthrown, including in those days Saddam. And so as a result, it's deeply embedded in the psyche of the leadership that they, in our view, that they want to bring down the ruling order in the Arabian Peninsula. So the issue isn't an issue of competition. It's an issue of offense against defense. So Saudi Arabia is playing defense, and Iran is playing offense. And then you take what they say, and then you look at what they have done over the last 30, 40 years. And you see that Iran has spent a disproportionate amount of its valuable resources projecting power. From Hezbollah to Iraq, to Syria, to Yemen, to Bahrain, to Kuwait, to the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. So they have walked the talk. So to put it simply, that's the way that. So Saudi Arabia sees this government as determined to bring down the ruling order and determined to control the Gulf one way or another. And the Iranians, we see them as having two faces. We see them as having, and when I say Iranians, I mean the regime, yes. Obviously, not the people or the country. But we see them as having two faces. One is smiling face, represented by their foreign minister and their president, who come here and say all the nice, polite things, and we want dialogue, and let's talk up, why can't we talk through our problems? Why can't we sit down and, while the Revolutionary Guard, which really runs Iran, and Qasem Soleimani, which really runs Iran, is going around creating havoc all around the region. So we see that two-faced game, and we see that a lot of people in the policy community in the West swallow it. So there's a fundamental mistrust of the Iranians, and there were a few attempts, by the way, in the 90s and in the early 2000s to reach out and discuss with them, and the feeling was that the Iranians just do that to present a facade of wanting to cooperate, while in reality, they're in the business of subversion.
Okay, so basically we have this revisionist versus status quo power. Rob, you know, as much or more than most American officials in recent years have had a chance to try to understand Iranian policymaking views. It's often a bit of a black box. It's a difficult system to grasp. I'm curious about what you make of Ali's answer about the Saudi view, but I would love to know from your best estimate the same kind of question from the Iranian point of view. What do the Iranians see as the motivating sort of animus here? And you know, where does the fear and distrust that we can presume they feel, and which they talk about, where does that come from their point of view, as you best understand it?
There's no Iranian on this panel.
Yes, that's right. That's right. No, and I'm trying. Yeah, as you best understand it from where you sat and where you sit.
But,
yeah.
you know, history is a funny thing, right? I mean, I listened to what Ali said, and he and I have had this talk many times. I've had the talk with Saudi leaders, with Emirati leaders, other leaders in the Gulf, and I understand it's a very profoundly held view, and there's no doubt about it. I think if you had an Iranian here, the Iranian would mention other things. Their threat perception, you know, soon after the revolution, a war with Iraq in which not just Iran's neighbors but the West sided with a country that was using chemical weapons against it. They felt that they were surrounded by enemies. They felt that their security was in danger. They felt they were a minority religious group and a minority ideological group in the region. So they have their own security and threat perception. I'm not sure, and one of the things that we do at the International Crisis Group is we try to put ourselves in everyone's shoes.
Sure.
So if you want to resolve the conflict between the Saudis and the Iranians, however one wants to describe it, however one wants to go back and look at history, the main thing is to understand what their interests are today and whether there's a way to reach a solution where both those core interests are addressed. So, you know, I don't know that we could debate here what are the Iranians right about how they view it, are the Saudis right? I think the main question is to realize how damaging this confrontation has been. It's damaging, obviously, for the people of the region. The proxy wars that Fran mentioned, they're costing lives on a scale that the Middle East hasn't known for a long time. Humanitarian costs, refugees, internally displaced people, economies that are devastated, whole generations in Yemen and in Syria that are not going to go anything but conflict. So that's, I think, where the focus should be. We could talk about root causes, which are important to understand how you go forward. But it may be true that Iran sees itself as revolutionary and Saudi as a status quo power. That only gets us so far. Iran is a state that does have interests, that has interests that it wants to see advance. Is there a way to accommodate some of those interests? As I'd argue we did with the nuclear deal, I'm sure we'll get into that. Mm-hmm. But that's one case where we tried to look at our interests, Iran's interests, and see whether we could find a place where they both met and they both intersected and overlapped. But if we're going to look at this as a inherent and implacable conflict between a revolutionary status quo power, we may not, here in New York, we may not be paying too much of a price, although I would suggest that it also costs us in terms of sectarianism and terrorism, etc. But the people of the region are going to pay a price that is far too high to afford.
Friend Rob basically, you know, gestured at the idea that is there a kind of a deal that can be made here. This is the kind of language that you'd think that perhaps our current president might, you know, respond to. That surely it can't be an implacable conflict that's doomed to go on and on. What do you think, from the point of view of a former, you know, a high-level official, when you look at this? Do you see any? I mean, I struggle to look at it, and when I look at the interests involved, it's very difficult for me to see how a deal could be brokered or anything could be sort of done. What do you think would be necessary from a U.S. policy point of view? Mm-hmm. And is it something, whatever the answer is that something that the U.S. can actually realistically contribute to at this point?
So, you know, I always say foreign policy is the third-grade math Venn diagram, right? Nobody acts unless it's in their own self-interest. So you got to figure out that the two overlapping circles, it's the shaded part. People only will act. You can ask people, foreign partners, to do other things. They're only going to do it if they perceive it to be in their own self-interest. The U.S. has got a self-interest here, when we ought to be very candid about that, in seeing this conflict resolved, not only for all of the humanitarian, absolutely right reasons that Rob states, but after all, the terrorism problem that we faced here in this country, at home and around the world, and against our interests around the world, has come from the region. And so, frankly, fundamentally from a U.S. position, to see this conflict at least more benign than hot, they have to Ali's point, mitigate, pull back from this expansionist view of their role in the region, right?
Both parties?
I don't. Well, let me say this. When I said that, what I'm thinking about is Hezbollah, the terror financing. We've seen progress in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia had a terror financing problem that they've made extraordinary strides against. I don't think we can say the same about the Iranians, given that they're the single largest state sponsor of money and weapons going to Hezbollah. But it's this interference in the internal affairs of others. And it's all these proxy conflicts. I think as long as that continues, we're not going to see a resolution of the conflict, and we're not going to see a cooling of it. From a U.S. perspective, we ought to care mightily about that internal interference that the Iranians are doing. And I think if you want to get the Saudis to the table to have a conversation, you've got to confront that issue.
Elliot, Rob mentioned the nuclear deal, and I'm curious for your take on this, because this is a big part of, that was basically an attempt by the United States to make some sort of policy difference here of some kind. It was a sort of intervention in this larger rivalry, if you'll forgive the expression, Elliot. Of course, there were other reasons for it too, but it represents maybe the best example of a U.S. step in that direction. What I'm curious about, though, is what's happened recently. And I'm hoping that you can shed some light on what do you think the Trump administration, or President Trump, is trying to achieve with this. I'm not even sure exactly what to call it. You know, if you call it decertification, they say, no, it's not. You know, it's not exactly clear what it is. But with this move on the Iran deal, what is the goal?
He won't speak for Iran. I'm not going to speak for Trump. But
your best estimate. As I said, it's a little bit of a black box, just like Tehran. So let's do our best.
Well, there was a standard Republican critique of the Iran deal. It was a wall-to-wall critique. It had support from just about every Republican member of Congress. It is in the Republican 2016 platform. Right. This is a terrible deal. It is not a treaty. Therefore, when we come to office, we can undo it. So, I mean, there are no surprises here. And the Republican critique was, this is wrong from top to bottom. It is wrong in its nuclear terms, that is because it is not permanent, because it permits enrichment of uranium. You may recall that when we, the United States, did the so-called 1-2-3 agreements with Jordan and the UAE about the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, we demanded that they agree never to enrich uranium, but now we're going to let the Iranians enrich. Ballistic missiles, enrichment, and so on. And the Obama administration made another argument, which was, this is just a piece of Iran policy. That was the argument they made. And you will see that when we can reach this accord, Iran's overall behavior will change. It will get better. There are some lines of President Obama suggesting this, and he was wrong. Because what we've seen since the Iran deal is that if Iran's behavior has changed in the region, it has changed for the worse. So you have the Trump administration saying, there's nothing new here. We were against this. We thought it wouldn't work. Now it's the fall of 2017, and what do we find? The so-called 24/7 inspection regime does not exist, and the IAEA cannot get to military sites. We find an increase in the amount of energy and money being put into the ballistic missile program. We find worse, let's call it conventional conduct in places like Bahrain, Syria. So from every point of view, it is what we feared it would be. Therefore, President, takes the position, I cannot certify to the Congress under American law that the sanctions relief is warranted and proportionate to the change in Iran's behavior, so I won't certify. And we know what we want to do to improve it. We want to make it permanent, we want to make it cover ballistic missiles, and so on. And so now we begin some diplomacy to see if we can get, first, the French, British, and Germans to agree that these would be improvements. I think that's their thinking, and they generally think that if I can put this in a different, more colloquial way, that the problem with the Iran nuclear deal was that we basically dumped our allies to do this deal with Iran, and that was a mistake.
Rob, you were shaking.
But other than that, I
during
think
part
it's
of that.
fine.
I mean, and as someone who's involved in crafting and conceiving this deal, tell me.
I realize this is not going to be a panel on the JCPOA. It would be here for 10 hours. But you know, let's say a few things about it. And Elliot and I have disagreed about this in the past.
We have.
I don't think, first to start off, you may find a stray sentence here or there, but I could then come up with 10 sentences in which the president and his administration officials said the opposite of what you just said he said. In fact, the Obama's argument was we need to take care of the nuclear program precisely because we have no expectation that Iran is going to change its behavior. And imagine this behavior with a nuclear weapon. And let's not forget the fact, and Elliot, I'm sure, was one of them, how many people in 2013, 14, 15 were saying this is the existential threat. You had Prime Minister Netanyahu going to the UN General Assembly with his diagram of enrichment. If they got over 20%, it's the end of the world. We took care of that problem. You may disagree on how well we took care of it, but that is, for now, in the box. So to say that it was a betrayal of our allies when so many of our allies, our Israeli ally in particular, was focused on this, I think that's a bit odd. As for the regional behavior, there's no magical solution. This is something that it's true of the Obama administration, it's true of the Bush administration, it's true of the Clinton administration. There's been a problem dealing with Iran's regional behavior that transcends parties, that transcends generations. It's not as a result of the nuclear deal. Of course, they have more money, they're going to do more, but let's be honest. We'd be having the same debate today about Iran's regional behavior if it weren't for the nuclear deal, other than the fact that we'd be more worried because some people would say they're rushing to a nuclear weapon. I'd say one other thing to bring it back to the Saudi-Iranian dispute, but I'm happy to defend the nuclear deal till
and I'm happy to attack it, so we can go on.
Because a lot of other things you said about the deal,
we can have a special breakout session with just the two of you guys doing it.
What's the greatest correlation between Iran's regional? What is the best indicator of Iran's regional behavior and its proxy efforts to expand its influence? Is it sanctions or an absence of sanctions? I would challenge anyone to draw on a curve and say, here's where the sanctions were tough, here's where Iran's behavior was better, here's when they were looser, here's where Iran's behavior suddenly becomes worse. The correlation is between instability and chaos in the region, which at times I fully agree Iran exacerbates, but chaos, instability in the region, and Iran's influence. Three quick examples. Iraq. How did Iran suddenly get such influence in Iraq? I mean, it's a pretty straight line from the U.S. invasion and toppling of Saddam Hussein and Iran being able to have influence. Iran's influence in Lebanon. Again, I'm not, and by the way, I'm not pointing blame. I'm simply saying Iran is very good at exploiting the war between Israel and Lebanon, going way back in the 80s. Yemen. How did Iran expand its influence? As the war intensified, the Houthis, by definition, who historically have not been pro-Iranian, as I'm sure historians here could attest, who are they going to turn to? They turn to Iran. Iran is all too happy to cheaply fund a movement that can tie Saudi Arabia down. And Syria, the more the civil war intensified, again, that's the regime's fault, it's also Iran's fault, but as the civil war intensified, Iran is able to have more of a presence there. So that's the correlation, which is why I say resolving conflict in the region is not simply good for all the reasons one could imagine. It's also the best way to make sure that Iran doesn't have that ability to go into other countries, which it has when there's chaos, when there's instability, when there are constituencies in those countries that need an outside ally because they feel like they're in the minority attacked by others, and they'll turn to Iran.
Ali, I want to extend the logic of what Rob was saying and ask you. You talked initially about Iran as a revisionist power, as a revolutionary power. I guess the question I'd like to ask is, when you talk about trying to roll back Iranian influence, whether it's in Syria or Iraq, wherever you see it, what is the end state that you or that folks in Saudi Arabia would be satisfied with? Should there be no Iranian influence in those places? And whatever that end state is, how much do you think the U.S. ought to invest, both diplomatically and militarily, to achieve that end state?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's a question of defining the type of government that Iran has. If you believe that Iran is a deeply ideological, theologically driven power that is determined to achieve these expansionist objectives, you take one view. if you believe that Iran is ultimately reasonable, a mature, self-interested power that will behave logically, you take another view. The view that many people have in the region, including Saudi Arabia, is Iran is the first, that you're dealing with people who have, you know, a deep historical memory, deep historical grievances, great ambition, and frankly are executing to that ambition. And let me just jump to a case study, for example. You know, the whole issue of Yemen. How much gross investment Iran has made in Yemen is immaterial. The question is that Saudi Arabia saw the Iranians reaching out to the Houthis over the last decade. The Iranians are very good in, the Iranians identified the Zaidi community, which is really a Shiite light community, as a potential zone of influence. The Zaidis have always been close to their neighbors. In fact, Saudi Arabia had supported the Zaidi community in the civil war in the early 60s. The royal family of Yemen were Zaidis. They were all given Saudi nationality. I went to school with them, you know, some of them. So there was never this Sunni Shia issue in Yemen. Iran identified the Zaidis as Shia light, but a community that they could start to cultivate. And soon after the revolution, they started to give scholarships and reach out to them. Now, that trajectory over the last 10 years went up and started to have a military dimension to it, particularly when the Houthi movement emerged as a rebel movement. It was fighting an internal civil war. The Iranians saw an opportunity. They started to reach out through Hezbollah and provide training, you know, the Iranians have mastered the sort of cookie-cutter approach to setting up, for the lack of a better word, terrorist organization or non-state actor organizations, and that trajectory began. When the Houthis took over the capital and they controlled Sana'a airport, the Iranians announced that they was going to start having 17 flights a week, and there is no tourist traffic between you know, Iran and Yemen. It was the beginning of a ramping up of that military support. Now, the point is, we come into the chicken and egg situation, where Rob and many people like him will say, the Saudis provoked this, you hit Yemen, the Houthis were desperate, the Iranians took advantage of it, and it's a cheap way for Iran. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is this: people had their eyes on a fault line on the southern borders of Saudi Arabia. They've spent 20 years working on it. The last 10 years, that curve started to go up. When the Houthis took power, there was a huge opportunity for them to ramp that up. And as far as Saudi Arabia was concerned, it could do nothing and see the Houthis be turned into a quasi-Hezbollah-like entity, you know, with a deep capacity to threaten the security of Saudi Arabia, or it could take preemptive action, which is what Saudi Arabia took.
Okay, but the chicken or the egg problem, you know, regardless of where you come down on whether it was a chicken first or an egg first, you know, we got to run the farm now. So what is the I guess the crux of my question was sort of, what would be an acceptable level of revolutionary influence in these places?
No,
and
there
zero?
is no reconcilable solution to the relationship with Iran with the present regime.
Okay.
What has to happen is that the Gulf Cooperation Council has to build up its internal strength to be able to deter Iran. Because one of the reasons was that the Gulf states have been traditionally weak. Iran is militarily much stronger. Yes, they don't spend the billions of dollars on arms, but it's a militarized, ideologically driven society with 10 years of experience in war. It's a very dangerous opponent. So America provided that umbrella. As that umbrella began to recede or be perceived to be receding under the Obama administration, the conclusion that Gulf countries reached was we're going to have to carry our own water, which Americans have been saying anyway. So that's why, for example, Saudi Arabia didn't pick up the phone and call Uncle Sam and say, come and help us in Yemen. It took on Yemen itself. And then everybody started to complain and saying, you're being impetuous and you're starting a war. Well, you've been telling us to carry our own water for all these years.
There are different ways of carrying water.
Well, it was fighting your own battles and not asking Uncle Sam to fight the battles for you, you see. So ultimately, that is the approach that the Gulf countries are taking. You see it in the military alliance between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain. And one of the reasons why there's an issue with Qatar today is because Qatar was seen as undermining the potential building up that alliance from within.
We'll come back to Qatar because that's an interesting point. Elliot, what Elliot is ultimately saying here, if I really want to reduce it, is there's really no permanent solution except regime change, right? And this has been an argument. There's a lot of different valences to this argument. There's the one that he's making. Another one has been simply that Americans and American presidents and policymakers have made is simply that the Iranian regime is unacceptable because of its conduct, not just abroad but at home. That this is a repressive theocracy. Right. And you know, one thing that as an editor, you know, here it sometimes becomes difficult when I see these arguments because I say, well, you know, can't I apply that argument to our partners as well? Can't I? Don't the Saudis execute people and repress minorities? And you know, aren't there allegations of GCC funding of Sunni terrorism? And I guess my question for you is, you've done a lot of work on human rights. This is sort of ultimately a political or human rights question. Isn't it sort of a hypocritical stance, the corollary to Ali's thing, which is to say that the Iranian regime is simply unacceptable because it's an unacceptable regime? Why is that an acceptable thing to say about Iran and not about Saudi Arabia?
Two reasons. First, the realpolitik reason. We have friends and allies, and we have enemies. The regime defined itself as an enemy of the United States the day that Khomeini came to power. We didn't choose them as an enemy. You can, you know, go talk to Jimmy Carter. We didn't choose them as an enemy. They chose to be an enemy. They have, the regime, not the people, have chosen to be an enemy of the United States every day since 1979. So there's a realpolitik question here. The second question is, I would introduce the word legitimacy. There's a huge difference between, I would say, the government of the Emirates and the government of Saudi Arabia and the Iranian regime. I would argue that the Iranian regime is an illegitimate regime in the eyes of its own people. I would argue that the regime has been at war with the people since 1979. And for those who would like to read more about this, Misak Parsa's book, Democracy in Iran. I mean, literally every day since 1979. So this is not just a question of human rights abuses, which certainly is, I mean, Saudi Arabia, from our point of view, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are obviously not democracies. They are monarchies with varying degrees of respect for human rights. But they are not illegitimate regimes, neither in the international system because of their behavior, nor internally because of the hatred of the people for the regime. They are legitimate regimes.
Fran, I want to ask you about, we're talking now, we've shifted a little bit from talking about the Iranian regime to we're introducing the let's say the Saudi regime. Let's limit it to that. Things are happening in the Saudi regime. Strange things are happening in the Saudi regime, and I myself have been struggling to try to make sense of them. What's your read on what, you know, sitting from Washington or New York, trying to figure out what is Mohammed bin Salman up to, what's happening inside Saudi Arabia? Should we be concerned, terrified, cheered? What's the proper American response to what's happening domestically in Saudi Arabia?
So I'll start with the punchline and work backwards.
Okay.
I would be encouraged and cheered, to pick a word that you used. Look, this is a population, I'm going to give you rough numbers, not exact. So approximately 70% of the population is under the age of 30. These have been changes that have been needed for a long time. And by the way, you asked a very difficult question of Elliot. He gave you the answer I would have given. And I would say to you, don't presume that because we have allies and partners with whom we have human rights disagreements, that we don't discuss them. We discuss them privately, we encourage them, we push them quite hard. Saudi Arabia is not alone in that category. You might include China in that category. So I would say to you that Mohammed bin Salman represents a new generation. I think the changes you're seeing could not have happened now without the change in the order of succession. It was only possible by virtue of that because he didn't have, Mohammed bin Salman, the current crown prince, did not have the history in government that his predecessor had. And didn't have the obligations and relationships that came with that history. And so I frankly think this is a real opportunity. It includes, you know, there are a bunch of changes, not just with the Crown Prince. We've seen a change in the Cabinet of Ministers. The ambassador here, Khalid bin Salman is a son of the king, full brother to the crown prince, fighter pilot, dropped bombs on ISIS in the current conflicts. He too represents this change. We're seeing a loosening of the rules in terms of entertainment, foreign investment into the kingdom, rights for women, including driving. And so I think that this is the beginning of, I'll use a Western phrase, of a reformation. But it had to be driven internally, and I think could have only been driven by someone like Mohammed bin Salman.
And you're confident that he has the skill set necessary to carry out this change?
This is not just one person,
Okay.
right? It comes from the king. It's not just Mohammed bin Salman. It has to have the buy-in of the cabinet of ministers. We've seen many changes there. And we've seen, look, an interesting sort of data point, at the most recent National Day, uncharacteristic for Saudis who tend to be, and Ali can correct me, quite reserved, there's cheering and dancing in the streets of men and women. It was not segregated. That tells you something about the support of the population for the changes. Does that mean it is 100% in uniform? No. Do I expect that they will have to deal with pockets of resistance from more traditionalists? Yes, but they will, they have been, but I think this is largely supported by this very young population that tends to see the world, this population under 30, much more like Mohammed bin Salman does than the prior rulers.
Rob, Elliot described this as a regime which is legitimate. Fran has painted a fairly optimistic portrait of where it's headed. Your take on this?
Well, first I want to react to what both Ali and
Right.
Elliot said, because I think in some ways I really want to thank them, because there's been a lot of debate about what is the objective in Iran, what's not the objective. I think it's pretty clear from what we heard that the objective will only be met with regime change in Iran. I say, and I think I'm speaking for more than myself in saying we've gone down that road before, and I dread to think of what it would mean for the U.S. to adopt that as the objective today. But I also want to say to this notion of legitimacy, I hold no particular sympathy at all for the Iranian regime, for everything they did, as Elliot said, including imprisoning people who I know well, including executing people, including all kinds of things, and it's not a democracy. But for us to sit here in judgment and saying they're not legitimate, but the Saudis and the Emiratis are legitimate, I want to quote our great leader, President Donald Trump, quoting our great philosopher, John McEnroe. You can't be serious. I mean, you can't sit here and say that we know that in the eyes of Iranian people, their regime is illegitimate. In the eyes of the Saudi people, their regime is legitimate. Fran just spoke about people dancing in the street. People were dancing in the street when President Rouhani was elected, and many people went out to vote for him. That doesn't mean it's a democracy. Let's be clear, and Ali has written about it. It's not a democracy. They don't choose their leaders through a means that we would consider to be legitimate. But for us to sit here in judgment and say Iran is not legitimate, the regime is not legitimate, and therefore, you know, step by step we get to the point that the objective has to be regime change. There are many countries on this earth that shudder when they hear Americans speak in those terms. We're not sitting in judgment about the legitimacy of that regime. Anyway, that's what I think, and I'm sure you'll respond.
Yep.
Saudi Arabia. So you know, I've been there several times in the last 2 years, and my view, and I've said it to the current leaders of Saudi Arabia, I think what they're doing domestically is extremely interesting. I mean, it really is, and the decisions they're making and some of the economic reforms, whether they have the ability to implement, what kind of resistance it's going to provoke, I don't know. My concern, and I've said it before, is the foreign policy, where I think the foreign policy could actually hurt what they're trying to do domestically because of overreach, and because I think it is self-defeating for their own objective. I really think that we have to think hard about how to push back against Iran. And the conflict in Yemen, which Ali spoke about, forget about the origins. You're right, it's much more mixed certainly than the Iranians or the Houthis would say. But the way the war has been waged, what the cost it's provoking in Yemen, and the ability that the Houthis and Iran have to really tie Saudi Arabia down. I said this to the Saudis when I was in the administration and the war began. I said, think about some historical precedents you may not want to think about. Think of us in Iraq. Think of Israel in Lebanon and in Gaza. Those wars don't cost the insurgent groups that much. As long as they survive, they win. And Saudi Arabia is going to be tied down. I said this in 2015. I said in 6 months it's going to be over. Here we are. It doesn't look like it's going to be over soon. So this is not a matter, I mean, there's the morality and the cost in terms of cholera and famine and destruction of a country. But in terms of the very objective that Saudi Arabia has, how could it help it to be tied down in a conflict that the Houthis and Iran, if they want, can perpetuate for as long as they...
Yeah, I'm going to let you all get in, but I do want to push you on one thing, though, Rob, which is that when you were in the administration, and you would say this to the Saudis, wasn't there some more leverage and something else that the U.S. could have done? If this is this horrible thing that the Saudis are prosecuting this war in a pretty brutal way, you know, and there's a lot of civilian casualties, there's a cholera epidemic, I mean, it's a bad outcome. It's one thing to say, like, oh, how could you have done this? Wasn't there anything we could have done to rein them in, or no?
Do I think that, am I proud of the outcome of our efforts in Yemen or in Syria for that matter? No. I mean, if that's what you're asking me. Did we try to shape Saudi behavior? We did. I think, as Ali said, there was a mistrust that had already built then, and so, you know, it became harder. And they are allies. They are allies, and so we, at the end of the day, when their security was at stake, I think the decision was we have to stand by them. I think there are lessons to be learned about the limits that a powerful nation has in exerting its power, and that's been true. It's true there. It's been true throughout history.
Okay, Elliot, you wanted to.
Okay, I just you mentioned, you know, our experience with regime change. I was part in the Reagan administration of a wonderful experience with regime change. It was regime change in the Soviet Union. We didn't have a war with the Soviet Union, but we made it crystal clear that we thought it was an illegitimate and evil regime. And I think the moral clarity, for one thing, helped politically. I think it helped advance the day when the regime fell. I think American military strength and the willingness to use it advanced the day when the regime fell. I'm not advocating invading Iran. I am making what I think, or I would certainly agree with what I think is a fairly obvious point, which is that these problems that we're talking about will not be solved as long as the Islamic Republic is in power. That's the legitimacy. Look, it's unlikely to be coincidental that in the Arab Spring revolts you had a series of fake republics fall and the monarchies didn't. And I think there's new literature now about why that happened, but it seems to me clear that a critical ingredient is legitimacy, varying degrees, but a fundamental legitimacy of those regimes.
You had a finger up at one point too, Ali. Was there something that
Yes, on Yemen, really.
Yeah, please.
It's a very
and then we'll talk more about Yemen. Yeah,
yes,
go ahead.
It's a very topical issue.
Yes.
The issue, obviously, you have to defend your national security. Any country has. So if you see an emerging threat on your southern border, where you associate a country as dangerous as Iran with the baggage that Iran comes, you have to take action. You can pick up the phone and call the White House, and Uncle Sam can take action, but he wasn't going to take action. Or you take action yourself. Now, Yemen was a quasi-failed state. It was suffering from a lot of problems. Certainly, going to war against part of Yemen was going to exacerbate that. But ultimately, the responsibility of the Saudi government is to the security of its own people. And that is its primary responsibility, the responsibility of every government.
Do you think the Saudi war in Yemen is improving the security of the Saudi people?
Yes, it is a lot. You see, two things. First of all, again, there has been the stories going around in policy and media circles that the Saudis was going to be shock and awe, and that they were going to bomb the Yemenis in a couple of weeks, and within 6 months this was going to be over. Saudi Arabia actually entered this with its eyes wide open. It had an experience with the Houthis 5 years prior, which had not gone well. The Saudi military had actually not done well with the Houthis, and it had ended the career of the head of the Saudi military at that time. So the Vietnam analogy was there, the Yemen historical analogy from the 60s was there. Everybody went in with their eyes wide open. They knew this was going to be messy. The question was that you had to do two things. One, you had to stop the Iranians from having a big pipeline into Yemen in terms of the capacity to deliver support. So you had to close down the airports and the seaports to force the Iranians to go from overt to covert support, to force them to go to smuggling, whether by little boats or through the border of Oman.
At a very high cost, we should say, though, to the civilian population.
Of course, but I mean, that is your internal security. The problem is you are looking at your internal security first. That is your prime responsibility. So you had to close down the Yemeni sea and airports. And number two, you had to send a message to the Houthis that we are not going to let you become another Hezbollah. And if you think you can flirt and with Iran and bring Iran to our southern border, you are going to pay a heavy price. Unfortunately, there's no such thing as a clean war, you see? And, you know, there's this myth. I mean, every war that everybody has ever carried out is dirty in a sense because civilians unfortunately pay a price. Look at the literature. Look at the literature that General Sherman wrote after the Civil War. You know, what did you do in the South? These things are unfortunately a horrible byproduct of politics and of war. But ultimately, the kingdom has to defend its national security, and it had to take action. So, of course, it's bad. And now, by the way, within all of that, you know, today there's a lot of complexity within Yemen. There is a huge humanitarian problem there, also because all the warlords in Yemen, the ones on the Saudi side and the ones on the opposition side, are mixing criminality with warlordism and are selling stuff. So there are a lot of other reasons that are contributing to the human suffering. But at the end of the day, Saudi Arabia cannot abdicate its national security because of that.
Okay, I'm going to let Fran and Rob both respond to that, and then we're going to move to questions. So if you guys can keep your responses to that brief so that we can get to the audience's questions. I'm sure they have a lot of stuff they want to know. There's a lot of stuff we haven't talked about. But please, go ahead, yeah.
So let me just add some context to what Ali was saying. I think the conflict in Yemen between the Saudis and Emiratis and the Yemenis is not new. We think of it as new because we're now aware of it and because of the size and scale of the humanitarian conflict. I will tell you, going back to the Bush administration, I can remember carrying a letter to Gaddafi when he was still running Libya to not pay money to the tribes in Yemen, including the Houthis, because he was determined to try and overthrow the Saudi monarchy. He was working sometimes with and sometimes in concert with the Iranians to make these payoffs to the Houthis and the other tribes on the southern border of Saudi Arabia. This is not new. They have watched this threat build on their southern border across 2 U.S. administrations. You're now to a third. And so to the extent that this has been painted as some sort of impetuous, brash act of the young crown prince, I think that's unfair. We can debate the merits of the conflict in Yemen, but I think to suggest that this was some impetuous act by a new leader is unfair and incorrect.
Incomplete. Okay, good. Rob?
30 seconds.
Yes.
Sorry, but Ali, yes, nobody's denying Saudi Arabia's right to defend itself. I think there's war, there's dirty war and dirtier war, and I'm sorry, and there are many other countries that have waged very dirty wars. I think this is a war, and we tried to help the Saudis wage it more cleanly, and we were unable to. That's number one. I'd also ask, if the goal was to make the Houthis not become a Hezbollah, are they more like Hezbollah today or a year ago? That's another question, just to ask in terms of whether it's succeeding. And as to regime change, so again, I think it's enlightening. It's useful to hear that people think the solution will only be resolved once the regime change. That may be easy for us to say sitting here, but it's consigning the peoples of the region who are suffering from these proxy wars if we say we're going to continue to wage it and continue to press back until the regime changes. That's consigning the peoples to the region to years and maybe decades of warfare and destruction. That should not be the U.S. mission, I believe. But anyway.
So appeasement would be then.
It's not appeasement. It's not black and white. Like either it's Saudi Arabia doesn't defend its security, or it wages a dirty war.
Well, appeasement light.
Either we, we could joke here, but there are conflicts that are going on as a result of this, what you don't want to call a rivalry, and we could say it's never going to end until the regime falls. It took quite a while in the Soviet Union. I find the analogy Soviet Union Iran a bit strange.
It took 75 years, and the regime was not born yesterday in Iran.
Right. Okay, but if we're prepared to live with that kind of, was it appeasement with the Soviet Union? Because we did have an understanding with the Soviet Union to try to calm things down, even though we consider the regime illegitimate. So anyway, I just worry when I hear that.
If you take the Soviet Union, just the Soviet Union analogy, I think it's interesting because the question is, do we believe that Iran is in the Gorbachev phase or in the Trotsky phase? We actually believe Iran is in the Trotsky phase. And I think you believe Iran's in the Gorbachev phase.
No, I don't. No, I don't. I've never said that. I mean, if I thought it was in the Gorbachev phase, it would mean that I think there's soon going to be a change of regime, which would then we'd all be happy.
Well, maybe
I have no idea.
Andropov
We've been so wrong about predicting the length of survival of regimes.
Right.
That for us,
track record is
Trotsky, Lenin, I don't know who it is. So.
Okay, I've let that go on. Actually, it's very interesting, and I wonder whether people may have some questions about that. But let's open it up. We have people who I'm sure have some questions here. The only thing I'll ask is I'm going to ask you three very simple things. Number one, please tell us who you are. Number two, please tell us where you're from, what institution, what organization you're from. And number three, most importantly, please ask a question. I don't want to interrupt anybody. I don't want to be that guy, so please don't be that guy. Okay, we're gonna start with the lady in the yellow dress here in the front. Who you are, where you're from, and a question quickly, please.
Thank you so much. Halima Croft, RBC Capital Markets. Ali, you said the key to running the farm was a strong GCC. Could you give us a sort of health check of the GCC? And we didn't get to discuss Qatar, so what are the plans for bringing Qatar back into the fold?
Well, I mean, I think actually the GCC has taken giant steps forward because key powers within the GCC, the two biggest powers, which are the UAE and Saudi Arabia, have developed a very close military and political alliance, and Bahrain has joined that. So while you do have conflict within the GCC, particularly with Qatar, you still have a core of a military political alliance that is actually fighting a war together very successfully. So that is the foundation of what could turn out to be, once Qatar comes back into the fold, a very robust regional security architecture.
Okay, the gentleman on the end of the aisle here with his hand up on my left-hand side. Yes, thank you. Just tell us who you are, where you're from, and please ask a question.
Albert Golson, I'm Executive Director of Indo-Brazilian Associates. We study geopolitical risk. Question on the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. There are rumors that he could rise to the head of Saudi Arabia in the very near future, matter of months. How would that change Saudi's foreign policy, particularly with respect to its neighbors, as well as Iran?
Who wants to take that? Friend, you want to take it?
Sure.
Yeah, you were talking about him before, yeah.
So, look, I think, again, talking about, they were saying, when we predict regime change, how often we're wrong. I think sort of speculating about the timing of a succession in Saudi Arabia is certainly not useful from an American. So, yes, I've heard all the same rumors. I don't think we have any reason to suspect that, it's only happened once before in the kingdom. I think we don't have any reason to suspect that the king just made the first and very significant trip to Russia. He seems to be in good form and good health, and so I wouldn't put a whole lot of weight in those rumors right now. Could it happen? Absolutely, but I don't think the Americans, including the intelligence community, are going to be all that good at predicting it. How will it change the foreign policy? Mohammed bin Salman chairs the National Security Committee. There's a more fancy name for it, but he's basically in charge of the security apparatus and the foreign policy now, right? And he makes the recommendations to the king. And so I don't expect that there would be wild swings, wild changes in their foreign policy or national security posture.
Can I just elaborate?
Yes, please, of course.
This rumor of abdication has been seeping through financial markets and going through the hedge fund community in New York. And even, I think, the Eurasia Group issued an opinion on it. It's nonsense, really. The king is healthy. He's enjoying his job. From minute one when he became king, he took on the role of chairman of the board. And so, effectively, the Crown Prince is the CEO. So, first of all, the abdication is not going to happen because there's no reason for it to happen, and he will serve as long as he's physically able to serve. And the Crown Prince is already playing the role of a CEO, really. So there will be no change. But I think we've tried to trace that rumor, and actually it seems to continuously come out from financial markets. And I think traders play that game because they take highly leveraged positions on something. They let out a rumor for 2-3 hours, and the market moves a little bit, and they make some money. So, yeah, actually,
does Saudi Arabia have a 25th Amendment, maybe?
Yeah, but it's actually funny because there are a number of rumors that come out, and they keep on being traced back to the hedge fund community in London and New York.
Okay, financiers, you're on notice. Yes, the gentleman with his hand up on the end of the aisle here. Please tell us who you are, where you're from, and please ask a question.
Robert Radway, Vector Resource Funds. I'm curious whether 1954, or how much of a role 1954 has in Iran's thinking about the U.S.
Okay, so we're talking about the coup. I'm gonna politely fact check you. I believe it's 1953. The coup in Iran. Who wants to take that? Rob, do you want to try? I mean,
very quickly, again, an Iranian should answer that question. It weighs heavily in their mind, and it's played heavily. In other words, even in new generations that may not know anything about it, but it's constantly reminded. It's one of the sort of the pillars of their, when they want to paint the U.S. as an enemy, as having had a hand in the coup, which I think has been historically established. And so that will be part of the trope that the regime, along with the downing of Iran Air, which cost quite a few lives, and the support for Saddam Hussein during its use of chemical weapons, those will be part of what the regime will remind people of when they say this is a country that you can't trust. Now they could add the fact that President Trump has called it the Arabian Peninsula, that I'm sure is going to
Arabian Gulf.
Arabian Gulf, yes. That's going to make it in the litany of accusations against the U.S. But it does weigh heavily, certainly on the older generation, but I think it's being passed on. How successfully, I don't know.
I'm going to make a shameless foreign affairs plug on this. Anyone interested in the question of U.S. involvement in those events of 1953 should read a really interesting piece that Ray Takei, who's a CFR scholar, wrote for us a few years ago about what really happened. There is actually a lot of historical debate about how involved the U.S. was. There was also an exchange with a younger historian, Christopher de Bellaigue, who kind of took issue with that. It's very interesting. I recommend it to all of you. It's a good read. Yeah. Next question. Yes, gentlemen, right here in the front, please.
Hi, Victor Lee with Trade Post USA. We're an international business publisher. It's been a great panel. I think the question's quite going for days. But I'd like to follow up on something that Fran said. I think we all view the liberalization of practices in Saudi Arabia optimistically. But I think, unfortunately, as we've seen in the U.S., these can, especially when you touch on cultural issues, they can really come with a backlash that you could never have imagined. So on the one hand, we think women driving as being fairly innocuous, but the same way that 10 years ago, gay marriage went from being nothing to really triggering a real strong reaction. What is the risk that as the society liberalizes, that all these forces that we don't currently see are going to come to the fore?
Look, I think there is. That's why I said it in my answer earlier. I do think it's a risk, but I think it's pretty telling. And Ali, help me with the numbers here. So there are 23 major clerics, and when these changes, before they were announced, the Crown Prince called them in and asked them their opinions without an open question. 19 agreed. 2 or 3 reserved judgment, 1 disagreed. But the Crown Prince, the notion that that is known to have happened, and that they were transparent about having asked the question of the clerical establishment that has tremendous sway in the cradle of Islam. Let's remember the king is known as the custodian of the 2 holy mosques. This is his preferred title. I think that says something about their willingness to play with their cards down, not just domestically, but internationally. There are going to be people of influence who disagree, but it's incumbent upon the Crown Prince to manage that process and to allow that to get it resolved in its sort of natural way. I found that surprising, that openness, that willingness to have the conversation in an open way and be transparent about it. I think that's a good sign, and I think that ought to suggest to us a willingness to engage domestically, including with his critics.
If I can just add a point.
Sure.
Look, you need a firm hand for such drastic change. For example, the issue of women's driving, every leader in Saudi Arabia has known for the last 50 years that it was a ridiculous issue. But the question was, it became a wedge issue with the religious right, if you want, and you needed the guts to take them on. This leadership has had the guts to take it on. So people have complained about sort of a restriction of liberties, about people being arrested. There is a bit of that, but you need that because you are going through fundamental historical change. You can either debate it ad nauseum for the next 20 years and get nothing done, or you can compress it and take some difficult decisions under a very firm hand. Obviously, you keep your ears to the ground, you watch for signals, you manage that as much as you can, but you also need a very firm hand, because Saudi Arabia has, these problems have accumulated that should have been addressed in the last 20, 30 years that were not addressed. So there is an inventory of issues that have to be addressed quickly. There is a risk, but that is why you need, you know, if you want the space that people have for debate has been constrained a bit, because had you let it go out, we had an issue where women, you know, where women activists went out to drive in the first Gulf War when the American troops were there, the American media was there. And I remember being in Riyadh at that time, and it went viral. Every mosque, every imam in every mosque came out against them. So the government this time managed the process and managed it very effectively. With a bit of intimidation, sure, consultation, but a bit of intimidation. Unfortunately, you need that, because major historical change, as we all see even in this country, when you want to do something like healthcare or something like that, it's so difficult to get a consensus, let alone in a country where the political spectrum between the far right and the far left is irreconcilable. So what you need, you have a lot of change happening now. You need a very firm hand to do that. You will constrain some liberties in the process, but the government is also keeping its ears to the ground and its antennas alert to react to market signals.
Sorry, I'm just going to follow. Has the hand not been firm for decades? I mean, I'm surprised to hear you say that that's necessary now.
No, well, it is. I mean, it's necessary with the clerical class. For example, there were about 40 clerics that were arrested.
Okay.
Again, arrest in Saudi Arabia is a bit more benign than it is in a place like Iran. You don't have the dungeons. People get, you know, held for a few months, sometimes for a few weeks. They're asked to sign a paper. Most of them end up getting released. But it's a signal. And I think that particularly because of what happened with women's driving in the 1990s, the issue was that they wanted to send a very firm signal that this is what we want to do. It has to be done. You better fall in line. And everybody fell in line.
Okay. More questions? Yes, the gentleman here in the third row.
My name is Angelo Lisboa, I work for JP Morgan. The question is for Ali. First, I would like to assure that I did not start the rumor. And second,
He said hedge funds. You're okay.
Yes, yeah. So let's keep it at there. So Fred mentioned the large portion of the Saudi population that is now on working age, right? The young, vibrant, and that's. I'm from Brazil, so we all know that emerging markets, one of the upswings is exactly that's a tailwind for a lot of economies. What is your view on a perspective of economic reforms? We heard about Saudi Aramco potential IPO, and how do you see the perspective on broader economic change to actually address that percentage of young, there are currently, a lot of them are unemployed because there are not that many job opportunities?
Well, there's a two-track to that. Today, if you are a well-educated, dynamic young Saudi, this is a very exciting time to be in the country. If you're U.S. among the 100,000 that come to America every year, this is a very exciting time to be in the country because so much is happening. If you are among the balance of that, among the youth, which are not that well educated, and unfortunately Saudi universities, you know, Saudi Arabia has mass-produced universities in the last 30 years. So we mass-produce graduates, many of them with mediocre qualifications. The solution to that is then going to be an economically expensive solution, but a socially necessary one, which is that the Saudi labor market has been so open to the world that you have 10 million foreigners in Saudi Arabia doing jobs. And I always give the analogy that I remember I was in training in JP Morgan in 1981, 82, and I was in London. To get a plumber in England at that time, you had to wait 2 weeks. You got a miserable plumber, an English plumber. You paid him a fortune. He did a lousy job, right? 6 months ago, if you wanted a plumber in London or before Brexit, you had an app. In half an hour, a Polish plumber came. He did a superb job at a fraction of the price. We may have to revert to the London old model, which is force companies to employ Saudis, even though they will be more expensive and less productive. But that is a political choice because you have to employ people. So it's the sense that the quality of service will go down, inflation will go up, but social peace will be attained. And the government is doing that. and it's doing that by diktat, maybe not very efficiently, but they're going by sector and saying, you have to employ Saudis here. And so there's that two-track, but it's a social and political necessity to impose national employment.
Ali said something very important there. They're encouraging more foreign direct investment than they have ever permitted in the past. A condition, a tie to that foreign direct investment is what are the number of jobs for Saudis that this project, this investment will produce. And that is a it is a direct tie and it is a direct piece of attracting foreign investment.
Yes, the lady with her hand up here in the third row, yes.
Joanne Leadham Ackerman, I'm on the board of Crisis Group. Could you just elaborate how you see the societies changing both in Iran and in Saudi Arabia as women are engaged more and more? And a second question, are the citizens of each country in any fashion communicating, exchanging, and is that the possibility of where more rapprochement can come from the base up rather than from the governmental level?
So people-to-people ties, and also the question of women, not just in Saudi Arabia, but also in Iran. Anyone want to jump in on that, our panel? It's a tough one.
I don't think there are tremendous people-to-people ties.
Okay.
There's the Hajj. Right? That's
There's the Hajj, but
sure.
that also is sometimes a bit segregated because, again, the Iranian regime believes that you turn the Hajj into a political opportunity, and that's always been underlying tension between Saudi Arabia and the Iranians, where Saudi Arabia says, this is a religious event, you come here to carry out your religious duty. The Iranians say part of the religious duty is to discuss the political issues of the day and to express our opinion about them.
And I would, I can speak to the women in Saudi Arabia. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia. And I will say to you, I think people here in the United States and in the West would be amazed. There are many today, long before this issue of driving came up and the liberalization, many female business owners in Saudi Arabia, quite successful, winning awards. And so I think you'd be surprised. I think this makes their lives easier, the ability to drive. But don't underestimate the role of women in the Saudi economy today, because it's quite significant. Well, you've got a woman who's the head of the stock exchange now.
We've had the first woman spokesman appointed for the Saudi government in
Right.
Washington.
And
So there's some symbolic steps
and a
being
deputy
taken.
governor.
Joanne, it's a good question. I think neither one is covering themselves in glory in terms of where they are today. Maybe they're going to, so I think there have been some positive signs. But in answer to your question, I think these are two countries that have still a long way to go. In terms of people to people, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong, and maybe somebody in the audience knows otherwise, there is none. These are closed societies. They don't particularly encourage their citizens to reach out to each other, to Iran and Saudi Arabia, vice versa. Whether there's some way around that, I think that's something to be discussed. But to my knowledge, as Ali says, that this is not sort of a growth industry, the people-to-people between Iran and Saudi
But on women, in fairness, there's been a big trajectory of progress in the last 5 years. And I can tell you, 10 years ago, if you had gone to a business, I used to run
There's not
No,
countries
it's the trajectory we
in which
always
there's
look at.
gender equality. Let's
Obviously, there's a long way to go. Saudi Arabia is not Sweden in that sense, but it's the trajectory that we're looking at.
There's a question here in the back, gentleman with his hand up there. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Ravi Chandran. Question though, how are the other emerging nations managing and looking at this prism of Saudi Arabia and Iran? You have India building out a port in Iran for their purposes. China is, trying to flex its muscles. You have other countries who are looking at this. So how are the other countries looking at this? Because there seems to be a push to get some business done, and they look at Iran probably as a good commercial opportunity as well.
Interesting question. Anyone want to jump on that one? The sort of beyond the region implications of this fight and the changes in these places?
I could just very quickly, I mean, some of the fight actually has negative consequences if you look at what's happening in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere, where the rivalry sometimes gets exported. In terms of business investment in Iran, obviously that was supposed to be one of the benefits of the nuclear deal, and as a result of the nuclear deal, you're seeing more countries investing in Iran. Whether the uncertainty created by the decision President Trump just took, and the uncertainty anyway about where things are going to go and whether the deal is still going to be in force in a year, whether sanctions are going to be reimposed. I think a key question is whether that uncertainty is going to dry up investment, and if that drying up of investment is then going to lead the Iranians to say, what's the point of sticking to a deal when the U.S., in their view, is violating or threatening to violate it, and on top of it, because of U.S. actions, the investment dividend and the trade and commerce dividend that we expected to get from it, we're not getting anymore. So ultimately for Iran, this is going to be a political commercial decision. Politically, it makes sense for them to stay. The deal so far, even if the U.S. distances itself because they could drive a wedge between Europe and the United States.
We have time for one last question. I'm going to go to the lady in the fourth row here, please, for the final question.
Hi, Sarah Orvin from Eaton Vance, which is a real money asset manager in Boston. Given the consensus on continued deterioration of the relationship, what does that mean for the states that are caught in the middle? Oman and Qatar come to mind. Thanks.
Yeah, is this how worried do they need to be, and how nervous are they? Should they be even more nervous? Who wants to take a crack? Elliot, you're nodding. You're mulling.
The states caught. I mean, this is true whenever there is a, let us say, a regional dispute. I mean, what about the mostly American allies, caught by Chinese expansion? They worry, and they wonder what the Americans are going to do and how far Xi Jinping is going to go. And if you live in the Baltic states, you wonder how far Putin is going to go and what the American reaction will be. And if you live, I would say, if you live in Iran's neighborhood, largely the same question. How far will the Iranians go, and how will the Americans react? And how will the regional powers, which in this case I would put as Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Israel, what will they do? They will triangulate with what the Americans do or don't do. So it's very hard to predict. Let's put it that way.
I think that's actually a pretty good note on which to end, since it could apply to almost everything that we talked about here today. Hopefully we've given you some tools from which to make some slightly better predictions, or at least not terribly wrong predictions. Let's thank our terrific panel here, and thank you all so much. This was really, really illuminating.
It was fun, as always.
As you know, the rest of the program, there's 3 more panels to come, including 2 breakout sessions in individual areas. Just consult your programs and you'll know where to go. Thank you again.
I'll give you my